This is the largest weapon ever deployed in human history. That's a tank. And that tiny figure beside it? That's a man, standing next to the ammunition this monster fired. The Nazis called it Heavy Gustav, 1,350 tons of steel, a 32-meter barrel, and a firing range of 47 kilometers. It took 4,000 workers to build it, 1,500 soldiers to operate it, and entire towns shook when the trigger was pulled. We dug deep into wartime archives to uncover how this impossible supergun, ordered by Hitler himself, was actually brought to life. A weapon so massive it bordered on insanity. June 8, 1942, East Prussia. The fog sat low over the forest, a cold, pale blanket smothering the earth in silence. And then the silence began to vibrate. Faint at first, a distant murmur beneath the soil, until the gravel itself trembled under the boots of the waiting soldiers. Heads turned. Men stopped mid-movement. Everyone knew what the vibration meant. The monster was arriving. From the white shroud of morning mist, locomotives pushed forward with agonizing slowness. Their engines screamed under the strain, steel couplings rattling violently as they dragged forward the first of many colossal pieces. Sparks flickered under the wheels. The smell of burning metal mixed with wet pine needles and coal smoke. Even the trees leaned away, as if recoiling from what was being birthed into their forest. Oberleutnant Hans Wiechert lowered his binoculars as the shape emerged, a towering slab of dark iron rising above the fog like the side of a battleship. "My God," he whispered. "That's only one section?" Dozens of officers stood behind him, struck silent. There was no discussion, no excitement, no arrogance, only awe. Because what rolled toward them was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a piece of a mountain, forged by human hands. The first segment alone weighed over 300 tons, hauled by multiple locomotives struggling against the sheer mass. This was merely a single frame section. The barrel, the recoil assembly, the breech block, all of them still trailed behind in separate convoys that would arrive over the next hours. Heavy Gustav wasn't transported as a gun. It arrived in pieces of a world-ending machine, and every man present understood one chilling truth. Once assembled, Gustav could never simply move again. Where she stood, she would fight or die. The assembly field had been carved out over weeks, a massive clearing in the forest reinforced with stone, timber, and steel plates. It was less a construction site and more the foundation for some ancient temple. Thousands of workers filled the grounds, swarming like ants across earth that shook with each new arrival. Cranes towered above them, creaking as they rotated with slow, painful precision. Chains thick as a man's arm hung from their arms, rattling softly as workers prepared for the unimaginable weight they would soon carry. A foreman shouted orders, his voice cracking under the strain. "Easy on the tension, slow the turn, watch the ballast." But even shouting felt pointless. The sheer mass of Gustav dwarfed human noise. When machinery groaned, it drowned out everything. Officers marched along the edges of the site, inspecting progress with stiff jaws and furrowed brows. The pride of Hitler's obsession was now their burden, and they feared being anywhere near this thing when it finally awakened. Teams of engineers in soot-stained coats studied blueprints pinned to makeshift tables. The drawings were overwhelming: lines, numbers, angles, pressure calculations, structural diagrams, and more warnings than solutions. Hitler wanted a gun that could crack the Maginot Line like a hammer hitting eggshells. Krupp's engineers delivered something even more extreme, a weapon capable of shattering reinforced concrete 30 meters deep. The cost? Everything. Time, steel, manpower, sanity. As workers guided the first massive frame section toward its foundation rails, the ground quaked. Gravel rolled in small waves. Tools rattled off benches. A young private instinctively stepped back as the monstrous shadow passed over him. He didn't even realize he'd been holding his breath until the segment settled into place with a metallic thunder that echoed through the forest. Witchett stared at the behemoth and exhaled slowly. And this is only the beginning. Behind him, other officers exchanged wary glances. None would admit it aloud, but they all felt the same thing. Gustav didn't look like a weapon. She looked like a punishment for dreaming too big. As the sun slowly pierced through the fog, the full scale of the project came into view. Steel rails extended across the clearing like the spine of some impossibly large creature. Work crews scrambled over scaffolds, tightening bolts the size of dinner plates. Sparks rained down from welders suspended on swaying platforms. The air was alive with heat, noise, and fear. Every man who approached Gustav felt it, the sensation of standing beside something humanity wasn't meant to build. And as the next locomotive screamed into the clearing, hauling another monstrous piece of the gun, someone muttered the words every soldier had been thinking. If this thing fires at full charge, will the barrel break the sky? The real work had only just begun. By the time the sun rose again, the forest clearing no longer resembled a construction site. It looked like an industrial battlefield, a place where man wrestled with steel and physics, trying to force something impossible into existence. Gravel was churned into mud, tools lay half-buried where exhausted workers dropped them, and the air tasted like iron and smoke. The second convoy had arrived through the night. Nobody forgot that moment. Even half-asleep workers stumbled outside their tents when they heard the locomotives growling through the darkness, dragging in what looked like the rib cage of some mechanical leviathan. Lanterns swung wildly. Shadows stretched across the ground like the arms of a waking giant. Now, in daylight, the gun skeleton grew piece by piece, section by section, rising above the assembly grounds like an unfinished monument. Men who normally joked and cursed their way through hard labour worked in near silence. Gustav didn't inspire humour, only a cold, reverent fear. Even the most seasoned engineers, men who had spent their careers designing artillery, admitted privately that this weapon made them feel small. Not figuratively, literally. Standing next to one of Gustav's steel trunnions felt like standing at the foot of a cathedral support column. Every bolt was the size of a man's fist. Every cable was thick as a wrist. Every crane groaned under loads no sane machine should ever hold. And above it all, the barrel waited. It lay on a separate set of tracks, covered in canvas and supported by reinforced steel braces. 32 meters of cold, precision-machined steel, a tube that looked less like a gun and more like a tunnel leading into darkness. Workers moved around it carefully, almost ritualistically, as if afraid to offend it. This was the heart of the monster. The breech block, a mammoth steel cube weighing several tons, arrived last. It was lowered into place with such intensity that every worker within 50 meters unconsciously stepped back. Chains snapped taut. Hydraulic pumps screamed. Cranes leaned into the burden like desperate animals. When it finally clicked into position, the sound exploded across the clearing, a thunderous metallic boom that silenced the entire camp for several seconds. It didn't sound like machinery. It sounded alive. Oberleutnant Hans Wichert watched from an elevated scaffolding platform, arms crossed behind his back. The breeze tugged at his uniform, carrying the acrid smell of welding flux and burnt oil. Below him, battalions of workers swarmed across the gun like ants scaling a steel mountain. Some hammered in explosive bolts, others guided heavy plates into position. Sparks flew like angry fireflies. The constant clatter of tools, shouting supervisors, and roaring engines blended into a single oppressive hum, the heartbeat of the monster. A shadow approached him on the scaffolding. "Morning, Hans," said Hauptmann Adler, his face smudged with soot despite never touching a tool himself. "You look like hell," Wichert replied. Adler smirked. "We're building hell." They stood in silence as another crane swung a massive support beam through the air, workers guiding it with ropes while shouting warnings to each other. "You ever think we've gone too far?" Adler asked quietly, barely audible over the chaos. Witchett didn't answer at first. His gaze stayed fixed on the workers below. "It's not our place to think that," he eventually said. "It's our place to finish the job." "But this," Adler gestured toward the towering structure, "this is madness." "It's war," Witchett said. "Madness is part of the uniform." Across the field, hundreds of soldiers drilled on the parallel tracks. Not with rifles, with procedures. Because Gustav wasn't fired by a gun crew, she was operated by an army. Teams practiced loading shell carts onto the rails. Others trained to hoist the massive projectiles, each one nearly a metre in diameter and weighing more than an automobile. The shells sat in neat rows awaiting their moment of violence. High-explosive rounds, concrete-piercing rounds, and the infamous 7-ton projectile designed specifically to obliterate fortresses. The soldiers weren't afraid of the shells. They were afraid of the gun they belonged to. One crew leader lifted a huge shell crane hook and held it steady while trainees practiced securing the sling. His voice boomed over the field. "Remember this, if the sling fails, you don't get out of the way, you just die faster." The recruits paled. The shell did not care. It was a strange sight, a field full of well-trained soldiers who looked more like factory workers than fighters. But this was Gustav. There was nothing normal about any of this. By late afternoon, the ground shook again, not from locomotives, but from the gun's frame settling into position on its double railway. Slowly, agonizingly, the pieces came together. The twin-track foundation had been reinforced with concrete pilings driven deep into the earth. This was essential. A weapon this size didn't recoil backward like normal artillery. It spread the shock across its monstrous frame and into the earth beneath it. Nature itself had to hold Gustav in place, and even nature struggled. As workers tightened the last of the support beams, an engineer climbed up to Witchett's platform. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he saluted. "Sir, the main assembly is complete." Witchett blinked. "Already?" The engineer shook his head. "Not complete. Just standing." Witchett exhaled. "Show me." They approached the edge of the scaffolding and looked down. There it stood. A colossal black silhouette against the tree line, a steel titan, a weapon humanity was never meant to build. And tomorrow they would load the barrel. Tomorrow the monster would open its eye. By dawn, the camp felt different. Every man sensed it, a tightening in the air, a heaviness that had nothing to do with the steel colossus towering over them. Gustav was no longer just being assembled. She was being prepared, and preparation meant something far more terrifying. Today, they would open the barrel. Rows of soldiers marched in formation toward the loading tracks. Not because anyone cared about formations, but because discipline was the only thing keeping sheer anxiety from swallowing the entire operation. The closer they came to the gun, the quieter their boots became on the gravel, until the sound fell away entirely. It was impossible not to feel small here. The barrel alone stretched across the clearing like a metallic horizon. Its mouth, a circular void big enough for a grown man to sit inside, stared at the forest with a cold, indifferent hunger. Workers climbed ladders against its sides, tightening bolts, checking weld lines, running measurements again and again. Nobody trusted the math. Nobody trusted the steel. Nobody trusted the fact that this thing was even allowed to exist. Gustav looked like the kind of weapon that would punish not just the enemy, but anyone who dared stand near it. Oberleutnant Hans Wichert made his way toward the eastern rail line, where a team of soldiers struggled to maneuver the enormous loading apparatus. Sweat dripped from their faces as they pushed the heavy platform into place. Even with machinery assisting, the weight was overwhelming. The platform groaned as it aligned with the cradle behind the breech. Hauptmann Adler joined Wichert, gaze locked on the massive shell suspended from a crane. "Look at that," Adler muttered. "A single round, heavier than my car." Wichert smirked. "Your car wouldn't survive being parked next to that thing." The shell hung in the air like a steel obelisk, swaying gently as workers guided it toward the loading tray. Its nose cone gleamed in the morning light, sharp enough to pierce reinforced concrete buried meters underground. One soldier whispered to another, "That's not a shell, that's a torpedo." He wasn't wrong. Even the high-explosive variant looked more like a small submarine than ammunition. Before they could load anything, the entire operating division was ordered into formation in front of the gun. A senior artillery officer, Oberstleutnant Kreutzer, stepped onto a raised platform, a thick binder tucked under his arm. He didn't waste time with introductions. "You will follow every instruction today without exception," he barked. "This weapon does not tolerate mistakes. It will not forgive you. It will kill you." He scanned their faces. No one spoke. "You will load only when ordered. You will move only when commanded. You will never, under any circumstances, stand directly behind the breech. If you attempt to take a look, we will bury what pieces of you we can find." A few recruits swallowed hard. Kreutzer continued. "This machine was not designed for humans. It was designed for destruction. Treat it accordingly." He slammed the binder shut. "Begin." The crane operator eased the shell downward, centimetre by centimetre. Ground crews steadied it with guide ropes, their boots digging deep into the earth as they fought its momentum. The slightest misalignment could rip the sling, crush a man, or set off a cascade of catastrophic failures. Wichert held his breath. "Slow, slow. Hold it." Clang! The shell touched the loading tray, the sound vibrating through the steel rails and down into the men's bones. Workers scrambled to secure it, tightening clamps and aligning the cradle arms. From a distance, Adler spoke in a low voice. "Do you ever think Hitler asked for this because he wanted to feel like a god?" Wichert didn't look away from the shell. "He asked for it," he said, "because he didn't know how to conquer underground fortresses any other way." "And Krupp?" Adler asked. "Krupp built it," Wichert replied, "because they wanted to prove they could." The truth was uncomfortable. Gustav existed because no one ever said stop. To load the round, the entire gun had to be elevated and rotated with near superhuman precision. Engineers turned cranks the size of tree trunks. Hydraulic systems whined under immense strain. Slowly, painfully slowly. The barrel rose. 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees. Workers shouted adjustments. Spotters yelled coordinates. Sweat poured down faces as the machinery creaked like an ancient leviathan waking from hibernation. When the barrel finally locked into position, a hush fell over the camp. It was aimed at the sky, like a titan pointing a finger at heaven. Wichert felt it in his chest. Awe, fear, pride, uncertainty, all tangled into a knot that refused to loosen. For the first time, Gustav looked ready. Ready to devour a shell. Ready to unleash violence that no weapon in history had ever matched. Ready to prove that man had finally broken through the ceiling of what artillery could be. "Advance loading tray!" The shell began sliding toward the breach, slowly, relentlessly. The workers guiding it stepped carefully, hands gripping metal, muscles trembling under the strain. Every eye was locked on the steel giant. Every heartbeat synced with the grinding of the loading machinery. And then, "Stop!" A supervisor leapt forward. The shell halted just centimetres from the breech's mouth. A misaligned support bracket had shifted under the weight. Had they continued, the entire shell could have fallen. A 7-ton cylinder of steel and explosive. It would have crushed anyone standing nearby. And the explosion would have taken half the camp with it. The workers froze, staring at the disaster they'd narrowly avoided. Witchert exhaled slowly. Fix it, carefully. The supervisors scrambled to correct the alignment, tightening bolts, double-checking supports, and shouting for more hands. After several tense minutes, proceed. The loading resumed. The massive shell slid into the breach with a deep metallic thunk that echoed across the clearing like a heartbeat. And just like that, the monster was loaded. Tomorrow it would fire. At first light, the camp didn't stir. It held its breath. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, as if the forest itself understood what was about to happen. Workers moved with quiet purpose, soldiers marched without chatter, and officers spoke in clipped whispers. Today, the monster would breathe for the first time. Gustav's massive silhouette towered over the tree line, framed by a pale sunrise. The steel of the barrel glowed faintly gold, condensation steaming off its surface as the cold night surrendered to morning heat. The gun looked less like a machine and more like a colossal idol waiting for sacrifice. And the sacrifice was coming, in the form of a shell already sitting deep in its steel throat. Oberleutnant Hans Witchert stood beneath the barrel, helmet tucked under his arm. The enormity of it still overwhelmed him. A man could walk into that muzzle and stand upright with room to spare. It felt like staring into the mouth of a god, or a demon. Beside him, Hauptmann Adler tightened his gloves. "You ever think we built something we shouldn't have?" Adler murmured. Witchert didn't look at him. His eyes remained on the dark void of the barrel. "Yes," he said, "every day." As the sun climbed higher, the final safety inspections began. Teams checked pressure gauges, hydraulic lines, recoil buffers, and structural supports. Another group patrolled the twin-track foundation, ensuring anchor plates and reinforced sleepers were secure. Every man understood the weight of what they were doing, literally and figuratively. If Gustav failed, it wouldn't just break, she would detonate. Engineers from Krupp walked the length of the gun in teams of 2, clipboards in hand, arguing about tolerances and stress limits. Voices cracked with nerves, not exhaustion. One of the younger engineers paused mid-step, sweat dripping down his face. "If the barrel ruptures," he whispered to his partner, "the blast radius will kill every one of us." His partner didn't disagree. By noon, a crowd of officers gathered at the field command station, a reinforced bunker dug into the hillside overlooking the gun. Inside, maps were pinned to every wall. Communication lines hummed with static. Artillery observers stood ready with binoculars and rangefinders. Gustav wasn't firing at an active enemy. She was firing at a distant target range carved into the earth miles away, a mock-up of reinforced bunkers, similar to what awaited on the Eastern Front. Oberstleutnant Kreutzer stepped forward, voice steady but hard. "Gentlemen, we are about to test the limits of engineering, and possibly the limits of God's patience." The officers exchanged glances. Kreutzer raised a clipboard. "Range, 42 kilometers. Elevation, 48 degrees. Charge, maximum. Objective, full power penetration test." He lowered the clipboard. "Prepare to fire." Every man not directly involved in the firing sequence was ordered to fall back, way back. Hundreds of soldiers marched to reinforced dugouts or retreated behind natural ridgelines. The ground crew below Gustav scrambled down ladders, abandoning the gun's scaffolding like sailors evacuating the deck of a ship before a storm. Only the essential firing team remained. They moved like surgeons around an operating table, calm, efficient, terrified. Witchert and Adler took their positions behind a concrete barrier nearly half a kilometre away. Even here, the vibration of the gun's internal mechanisms travelled through the ground. The monster was awake. The firing crew chief stepped forward, gripping a long metal firing lever connected by cable to the gun's ignition system. He shouted over the roaring wind, "All men clear!" A ripple of responses echoed across the field. "Clear! Clear! Clear!" The echo bounced off the tree line like distant thunder. Richard gripped the railing of the observation platform. Adler adjusted his binoculars, though he knew he wouldn't see much, only shockwave and smoke. Kreutzer raised a red flag. This was it. Firing in 10! The world seemed to hold its breath. 9. The wind died. 8. Birds fell silent. 7. Even the clouds seemed to stop drifting. 6. Sweat dripped from a dozen brows. 5. Hands trembled. 4. Teeth clenched. 3. Hearts pounded. 2. Silence. 1. Fire! The firing lever snapped down. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the world split open. The sound wasn't a boom, it wasn't thunder, it wasn't anything the human ear was meant to hear. It was a physical force, a crushing wave that slammed into the chest, rattled bones, and punched the air from lungs. A blinding white blast erupted from the barrel, followed by a plume of fire that stretched out like a dragon's breath. The recoil system groaned, shoving the gun backward several meters along its rails with enough violence to rip apart lesser machines. The ground rolled. Dust exploded upward. Men staggered even behind reinforced cover. Adler dropped his binoculars, eyes wide. "Holy Mother of—" Witchert didn't respond. He couldn't. His jaw hung open as he stared at the beast in disbelief. The shockwave hit a second later, a wall of wind so fierce it knocked hats off heads and sent papers spiralling into the sky. Far downrange, at the target site nearly 50 kilometers away, observers felt the ground erupt as the shell struck like a meteor. It penetrated 10 meters of reinforced concrete, then detonated. The resulting explosion carved a crater the size of a small building. Silence returned slowly, hesitant, like the world wasn't sure it was safe yet. A thin haze drifted over the assembly grounds. The gun barrel steamed. The metal framework hummed with residual tension. Finally, Kreutzer broke the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, the monster works." Some men cheered. Some laughed in stunned relief. Some simply collapsed to the ground, overwhelmed by what they had just witnessed. But Witchert and Adler remained silent, because what they felt wasn't triumph. It was fear. Fear of what Gustav would be used for. Fear of what this meant for the Eastern Front. Fear of a weapon so powerful it defied reason, yet now existed, ready to be unleashed on real cities, real fortresses, real people. Adler finally spoke. "Hans, we shouldn't have built this." Richard nodded slowly. "But we did." Heavy Gustav would soon be transported east, toward Sevastopol, where its shells would shatter Soviet fortifications, pulverize underground bunkers, and collapse ammunition depots hidden deep beneath the earth. It would fire dozens of times. It would destroy targets no other weapon could even scratch. It would reshape the battlefield with every shot. But it would also reveal a brutal truth. No matter how large the weapon, no matter how powerful, a single gun could never turn the tide of a war already lost. And in the end, the monster would be abandoned, dismantled, and destroyed by the very soldiers who once feared it. Because nothing built from madness lasts forever.